The lawyer's voice was calm, almost detached, as he read the final lines of my grandmother's will. To Daniel Chandler, I leave the condominium at Green Lake, Seattle, including all associated rights and financial accounts. To Sophie Chandler, he paused briefly, his eyes shifting toward me, I leave the family farmhouse and adjoining wetlands near Klamath Marsh, Oregon. The words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Daniel smiled, smug and satisfied, already pulling out his phone as if to text someone the news. His wife leaned over and whispered something that made him chuckle under his breath. I heard it anyway, a swamp shack perfect for her. Eric, my husband, didn't even try to hide his disappointment. That's it? A rundown farmhouse? Sophie, we don't need some rotting shack in the middle of nowhere. We need real assets, something we can sell. He rubbed his forehead, muttering, Unbelievable. The lawyer cleared his throat. There is also a sealed envelope specifically addressed to you, Miss Chandler, at the request of your grandmother. He slid it across the polished table toward me. My name, written in her familiar looping script, stopped me cold. I hadn't seen her handwriting since the last birthday card she sent me, 2 years before she passed. The meeting ended quickly. Daniel was already on his phone arranging renovations for his new condo. Eric stormed out muttering about mortgage payments. And I stood there, holding a deed to a place I barely remembered, and a letter that felt heavier than paper should. Back home, Eric didn't even wait before starting in again. We should sell it immediately, Sophie. We could pay off the visa, maybe put a down payment on a real place. Why keep a dump like that? It's useless. I didn't answer him. I was already sitting at the kitchen table, fingers trembling as I broke the wax seal on my grandmother's letter. Her words were written in the same steady hand I remembered. My dear Sophie, the house is waiting for you. It is not worthless, no matter what others say. It holds something only you can understand. Go there alone. Stay one night, listen, and you will know why I left it to you. My throat tightened, tears stinging unexpectedly. For the first time in years, someone had asked me to listen, not to them, but to myself. That night, while Eric ranted about bills and practical decisions, I quietly packed a bag. In the morning, I called work, requested a week off, and loaded my car. I didn't know what I would find in Klamath Marsh, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to go. The city faded behind me faster than I expected. One moment, Portland's skyline glimmered in my rearview mirror, steel and glass reflecting the pale morning sun. And the next, it was gone, replaced by open highway and a sky that seemed impossibly wide. I hadn't driven this far south in years, maybe ever, but the road felt oddly familiar, like an old song I couldn't place. Traffic thinned the farther I went. Towering pines lined both sides of the road, their branches interlocking overhead like green cathedral arches. The air changed too, lighter, cooler, carrying the sharp scent of cedar and something sweeter I couldn't quite name. My grandmother's letter sat in the passenger seat, folded and refolded so many times it had begun to fray at the edges. Every mile, I caught myself glancing at it, as if it might answer all the questions piling up in my head. By midday, the landscape shifted again. The ground turned softer, wetter, patches of shallow water gleaming like mirrors among tall reeds. The GPS had lost signal 10 miles back, leaving me to follow the kind of printed map I hadn't used since college. My tires crunched gravel as I turned onto the narrow road leading into Klamath Marsh. The quiet here was different, thicker somehow. No constant hum of traffic, no planes overhead. Just wind skimming the surface of the marsh and the occasional cry of a loon in the distance. It made my chest feel both tight and strangely free, like I was stepping out of one life and into another. When I finally saw the house, I stopped the car without meaning to. From the outside, it looked every bit the swamp shack Daniel had mocked. Peeling paint, sagging porch, shutters barely hanging on. And yet it didn't feel abandoned. Something about it stood tall, as if it had been waiting, just like Grandma said. "You must be Sophie." The voice startled me. I turned to see a small, wiry woman leaning on the fence line, her sharp gray eyes fixed on me. Name's Marjorie Hayes. Your grandma and I were neighbors for 40 years. I managed a polite smile. You knew her well. Better than most, she said, her expression softening. She always said the house would find its way back to you. Guess she was right. I looked back at the house, trying to ignore the shiver running up my spine. She said it was waiting. Marjorie nodded slowly. It does that, you know, for the right people. She smiled again, but there was something knowing in it, like she was watching me step into a story I didn't understand yet. I tightened my grip on my bag and headed toward the porch. The steps groaned under my weight, but didn't give way. The key slid into the lock like it had been used yesterday, and when the door swung open, the scent of apples and honey hit me so hard I froze. This place wasn't empty. It was alive, and it had been expecting me. I hesitated on the threshold, gripping the doorframe as though it might push me back. The scent of apples and honey lingered in the air, warm and welcoming, impossible for a house that had supposedly sat empty for years. My boots tapped against the hardwood floor as I stepped inside, the sound oddly muffled, like the house didn't want to echo. The living room looked nothing like I expected. There was no dust, no cobwebs, no sign of neglect. A knitted throw lay folded neatly on the sofa. The coffee table was bare, except for a small ceramic bowl holding 3 perfectly polished red apples. A brass clock on the mantel ticked softly, as if someone had wound it that very morning. I caught my breath. Hello. My voice trembled slightly, ridiculous as it sounded, but part of me expected an answer. Silence, warm, unthreatening but very present. I walked toward the kitchen, my eyes scanning every surface. The counters were spotless, the sink dry, and on the table sat a loaf of bread under a linen cloth. Steam curled from its edges when I lifted the cloth, like it had just come out of the oven. I touched the loaf with my fingertips. It was warm. Okay, that's not possible, I whispered. Behind me, the old screen door creaked softly as if pushed by wind, but there was no wind. The windows were closed, the air still. My skin prickled, yet I didn't feel fear. If anything, it felt like stepping into a hug you didn't know you needed. The hallway beyond the kitchen led to 2 bedrooms and a small bathroom. The first bedroom smelled faintly of lavender, with an old iron bed neatly made and a quilt folded at the foot. The second room held a writing desk and an empty wardrobe. A single photograph hung on the wall, my grandmother holding me on her lap when I was maybe 6 years old. I hadn't seen that photo in years. I stopped and stared at it, my throat tightening. She'd kept it here in this room, waiting. The house groaned softly, as old houses do, but there was a rhythm to it, like a contented sigh. My grandmother's words from the letter came rushing back. Stay one night, listen, and you will know why I left it to you. The sound of the floor, creaking behind me, made me spin around, heart hammering. No one was there. The hallway was empty, still and calm. But my chest wouldn't stop tightening. Grandma, I whispered, barely audible. My own voice sounded too loud. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a faint draft moved through the hall, brushing my cheek like a soft hand, and I swore I heard a whisper, not words, just the shape of one, as if the house itself had breathed. I stepped back into the living room, my gaze sweeping over the details I had missed before. The photographs on the mantel, the small crystal vase holding a single dried rose, the woven rug in front of the hearth. None of it looked abandoned. None of it looked neglected. It looked loved. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't a house waiting to be sold or gutted or flipped. This was a home, and somehow it had been waiting for me. I set my bag on the sofa and sat down, feeling the strange warmth of the room seep into me. For the first time since leaving Portland, my shoulders loosened, the knot in my stomach easing. Maybe I was imagining things, maybe it was just the emotional weight of Grandma's death. But I couldn't shake the sense that I hadn't walked into an empty building. I had walked into something alive, something that had been expecting me. As I leaned back, my eyes drifted to the ceiling, and that's when I noticed it. A faint line of dust disturbed near the far corner, like a hidden seam. A hatch? An attic entrance? The house seemed to sigh again, as if it knew I'd seen it. The seam in the ceiling kept pulling at my attention. It wasn't obvious, just a faint line of disturbed dust near the far corner of the living room, barely visible unless you were looking for it. I stood on the sofa, stretching to touch it, and felt the edge of a recessed handle. An attic hatch. A step ladder leaned neatly against the back porch wall, almost too conveniently placed. I brought it inside and climbed up, pulling the hatch gently. It opened with a slow groan, a puff of air carrying the faint scent of cedar and something older, paper, maybe in time itself. The attic wasn't what I expected. No piles of broken furniture or moth-eaten clothes. Instead, it was intentional. A single room, small but perfectly arranged, with bookcases lining both walls and a sturdy writing desk under the gable window. Everything was clean, organized, almost reverent, as if someone had tended it even after my grandmother's passing. On the desk sat an envelope with my name written in her careful, slanted handwriting. Sophie. My hands shook as I opened it. If you are here, it means the house has accepted you. It has waited, just as I asked it to. This land and this home have always protected us, but they ask for something in return. Care, honesty, and the willingness to listen. There are those who see only what they can take, but this place will show you what it truly is. Trust it, Sophie. Trust yourself. This room is now yours. Use it well. I pressed the letter to my chest, the paper soft and warm from my hands, and sank into the chair. The drawers beneath the desk were locked, but a small brass key was taped to the underside of the writing surface. I used it to open them and froze. Inside were deeds, maps, and old journals. The property wasn't just the house and 25 acres mentioned in the will. It was hundreds of acres, wetlands, old-growth forest, and, according to one survey, mineral rights buried deep beneath the marsh. I flipped open one of the journals, the pages yellowed and fragile, but the handwriting still bold. It belonged to my great-grandmother. She wrote about the boundary, a place in the marsh that was never to be disturbed, and the family's role as its guardian. There were sketches of ponds marked with strange symbols, notes about rare wildlife, and warnings about outsiders seeking what lies beneath. Another folder contained photographs, black and white images of men in suits standing at the edge of the marsh, holding maps, their faces obscured by hats. On the back of one photo, my grandmother had written, "They never stopped trying." I sat there, staring at the evidence of a history I never knew existed. My family had been fighting to protect this land for decades, maybe longer, and now it was my turn. For the first time since she died, I felt like my grandmother was right there with me, her presence woven into the wood and walls, urging me to stand firm. The house creaked softly behind me, like an old friend shifting its weight. I whispered into the empty room, "I'll take care of it, Grandma. I promise." A warm breeze, impossible for a sealed attic, brushed my cheek, and the small gable window rattled lightly as if in answer. This wasn't just a home anymore. It was a responsibility, and maybe even a legacy. The first night, I slept in the front bedroom, the one that smelled faintly of lavender. I expected it to feel cold, lonely, maybe even a little haunted. Instead, it felt safe. The sheets were soft, the air warm despite the old windows, and when I woke in the middle of the night, I thought I heard a faint hum, almost like a lullaby coming from the walls themselves. It should have been eerie, but it wasn't. It was comforting, like being watched over. The mornings became their own ritual. I'd wake to the smell of something sweet, apples, sometimes honey, occasionally warm bread like the one from my first day. I checked the kitchen every time, convinced I'd find some old automated timer or a neighbor sneaking in, but there was nothing. The house simply gave. I stopped questioning it after the third morning and just whispered a quiet thank you into the air. By day, I cleaned. Not because the house needed it, it was already surprisingly immaculate, but because I wanted to know every inch, every detail. The more I touched, the more I noticed little things. A hidden heart carved into the banister, initials etched under a windowsill. Notes my grandmother had left in small, almost secret handwriting like, "Plant mint here, it keeps away ants," or "Watch for owls in the east tree." This was more than a house. It was a story. The yard took longer. The fence out back had sagged from years of rain and neglect. And that's how I met Luke Dawson again. He pulled up in an old red pickup, climbed out in work boots and a faded flannel shirt, and said, "You planning to wrestle that fence into shape on your own?" He smiled, kind but cautious, like someone who'd learned not to overstep. "I was trying," I admitted, holding up a hammer that probably wasn't meant for fence posts. Luke chuckled. "I'll bring my tools by tomorrow. No offense, but you're going to need more than good intentions." True to his word, he showed up the next morning with a post driver and enough wire to fix half the property line. We worked in silence for a while before he said, "Your grandma was special. She loved this land more than anyone I've ever known. Used to tell folks the marsh was alive, that it would take care of you if you respected it." I smiled faintly. She might have been right about that. He glanced at me, but didn't pry. Instead, he told me about the local farmer's market, the best way to keep deer from eating young plants, and where to get fresh seedlings for spring. It was easy, natural, like we'd been neighbors for years. Afternoons were quieter. I walked the property, exploring paths my grandmother must have worn into the earth. There were places where the ground felt different, cooler, almost humming underfoot. And I remembered the journals talking about the boundary. I didn't understand it yet, but I could feel something unique in the air, a kind of energy that made me breathe deeper. Nights were for reading. The attic journals became my obsession. I read about seasons when storms nearly wiped out the marsh and how my family fought to keep the land safe from developers decades ago. I read about rare plants and migrating birds, even notes about mineral deposits that apparently made the land so valuable to companies like Cascade Resources. My grandmother had written one line, bold and underlined, "Never sell, never surrender it." Those words became a mantra in my head. For the first time in years, I felt purpose, not as someone's wife or someone's sister, but as myself, standing exactly where I was meant to be. On the 5th day, I woke to find a basket on the porch. Fresh vegetables, eggs, and a jar of golden honey. A small note read, "Welcome home. Emash." I smiled, knowing it was from Marjorie. That night, she came by in person, bringing a stack of old recipes my grandmother used to love. "She always said you'd come back one day," Marjorie said, her eyes shining. "And she told me to tell you, don't be afraid when the house talks. That's just its way." I laughed nervously. "You're saying it's alive?" Marjorie shrugged like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. "Maybe not like you and me, but yes, in its own way." Later, lying in bed, I heard a soft creak from the hallway, then the faint smell of apple pie filling the air. I whispered, "Good night, Grandma, and thank you." The shutters rattled gently, even though there was no wind. This wasn't just healing, it was transformation. I hadn't realized how broken I'd been until the house, the land, and even these neighbors began stitching me back together, piece by piece. It started with a phone call. I was kneeling in the garden, hands deep in rich soil, when my cell phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. I hesitated, wiped the dirt on my jeans, and answered. "Ms. Chandler." The voice was smooth, professional, and unsettlingly polite. "My name is Victor Hale. I represent Cascade Resources. First of all, congratulations on your inheritance. We understand you've recently taken possession of the Chandler property near Klamath Marsh." I froze, my grip tightening on the phone. "How do you know that?" He laughed softly, a sound rehearsed enough to feel fake. "Public records, Ms. Chandler. We keep an eye on unique opportunities, and your property is one of them. Cascade is prepared to make you a very generous offer, well above market value, for the house and all associated land rights. I didn't even have to think. It's not for sale. There was a pause, long enough for me to hear the faint hum of an office behind him. Perhaps I wasn't clear. We're talking 7 figures, Ms. Chandler. Life-changing money. You wouldn't have to worry about bills ever again. No, I repeated, sharper this time. His voice cooled. These things, they tend to work themselves out, one way or another. Keep my card just in case. Click. The call ended. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled into the driveway. Victor Hale stepped out in an immaculate suit that looked like it had never seen mud, his smile a little too wide. Ms. Chandler, he greeted as though we were friends. May we talk? I stayed on the porch, arms crossed. You already called me. My answer hasn't changed. His eyes flicked toward the marshland behind me. This land is unique, valuable. Companies like ours have the resources to make it thrive, to make it profitable. Holding on to something like this, well, it can be more trouble than it's worth. I didn't blink. Get off my property. For a split second, something hard flashed in his eyes before he smiled again. Of course, but do think about it. Progress doesn't wait for anyone. He slid a card into the porch rail and left without another word. That night, the house felt different. Not unsafe, but alert, like a dog pricking its ears at a strange noise. The shutters tapped against the siding despite still air, and when I checked the front door, the lock had engaged on its own. I whispered into the quiet, "It's okay. I'm not selling." The following morning, Luke pulled up in his truck, a coil of fencing wire in the back. Heard Cascade's been sniffing around, he said, leaning on the porch rail. Yeah, Hale came himself, offered me 7 figures. Luke shook his head. They've been after this land for years. Your grandma kept them out, but they don't give up easy. They'll try again, maybe through lawyers, maybe by sneaking survey teams in when you're not looking. He was right. That evening, I caught 2 men in reflective vests near the southern fence line, pretending to be birdwatchers. When I confronted them, they mumbled something about public access trails and left quickly, their boots leaving deep ruts in the soft ground. By nightfall, things escalated. The old generator shed near the marsh had its padlock snapped clean, tools scattered on the ground. I called Luke, who showed up within 15 minutes, shotgun slung casually over his shoulder. This is how they start, little intimidations to make you want to sell, he said. But don't. You hear me? Don't give them what they want. I looked past him toward the marsh. The air seemed thicker, heavier, and then, for just a moment, I heard it, a faint whisper through the reeds, almost like words, though I couldn't understand them. Goosebumps rose on my arms. Did you hear that? I asked. Luke frowned. Hear what? Never mind, I whispered, but deep down I knew. The house, the land, whatever this place was, it didn't want them here either. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house felt purposeful, every shift of the wind deliberate. When I finally drifted off near dawn, I dreamed of my grandmother standing at the edge of the marsh, her hand raised as if warning me back from something unseen. I woke with a start, heart pounding, but strangely certain of one thing. Cascade Resources wasn't just after land. They were after something specific, and my family had known it all along. The days after Cascade's visit felt different, heavier somehow, but the house seemed determined to keep me grounded. Every morning, I woke to sunlight filtering through lace curtains and the smell of something faintly sweet, like honey warming on the stove. I stopped questioning it. I just whispered thank you and started my day. I poured myself into the land. The garden beds, neglected for years, became my therapy. I turned soil, planted seeds, and built trellises for tomatoes and beans. Luke showed up almost every afternoon, always with something practical in hand, a new rake, extra posts for the fence, even a weathered beekeeping manual. Figured you might need this if you want to keep the hives running, he said one day, nodding toward 3 old wooden hives at the edge of the orchard. Your grandma used to sell honey at the farmer's market. Best stuff in town. I knelt beside one of the hives, listening to the faint hum within. They're still active. Barely. Need some work, but it's doable. Bees don't just up and leave when they've got a good place, kind of like people. He smiled, small and shy, then bent to tighten one of the fence posts. We worked side by side often, rarely needing many words. Sometimes we'd share lunch on the porch, fresh bread, eggs from Marjorie, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. In those quiet moments, I learned pieces of Luke's story, how he'd grown up here, how he'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years ago, how he almost sold his vineyard until he decided to fight for it instead. Land's more than dirt, he said once. Gaze on the marsh. It's memory. It's roots. You give up on that, you give up on yourself. His words stuck with me because that's exactly what I'd been doing. Living in a life that never fit, clinging to a marriage that had stopped loving me long before I admitted it. The house seemed to know. It embraced me in small ways. A breeze through the kitchen when I was about to cry, the faint smell of lavender when I couldn't sleep, the shutters rocking gently on windless nights like a lullaby. By the second week, I had started going to the local farmer's market, just like Grandma once had. People remembered her. They welcomed me like an old friend rather than a stranger. I sold jars of the honey still stored in the pantry and baskets of early vegetables. Your grandma always said this land had a way of healing folks, one woman said, holding a jar of honey to the light. Looks like it's healing you too. And it was. Slowly, I stopped looking over my shoulder for Eric's texts or Daniel's smug phone calls. I stopped checking my email like my life depended on work deadlines. Instead, I woke up thinking about the weather, soil moisture, and which seedlings needed repotting. My hands grew calloused, my arms stronger, and my heart lighter. One evening, I sat on the porch with Luke, coffee mugs in hand, watching the sun melt into the marsh. The sky burned orange and gold, and the frogs were already singing. "You've changed," he said suddenly. I laughed softly. "In a good way. In the best way. You look like you belong here." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, staring at the house silhouetted behind us. It feels like the house wants me here, like it's been waiting. Luke didn't flinch. That's because it has. Some places choose their people. That night, as I lay in bed, the house gave a soft, almost affectionate groan, the floorboards sighing under no one's weight. I smiled into the dark. Maybe Grandma was right. Maybe this place was alive and it had chosen me. It started with a letter slid under my door. The envelope bore the Cascade Resources logo, sharp and metallic, like it wanted to cut me. Inside was a notice. They were filing an expedited purchase order through an old land use loophole, claiming the marsh was of strategic development interest. My stomach tightened. I called Luke immediately. "They're trying to take it through some kind of emergency order," I said, pacing the porch. He arrived within 20 minutes, face hard. That's how they work. Apply pressure until you give up. But they don't know who they're dealing with. He glanced toward the house. "Your grandma kept something for exactly this kind of fight, didn't she?" I led him to the attic. We spread deeds, maps, and journals across the old desk. One document in particular stood out. A conservation clause, decades old, signed by state officials, classifying large sections of the property as heritage land. "This means no one can touch it," Luke said, eyes bright. "Cascade's bluffing. With this, they can't even put a shovel in the ground." We brought the papers to Peter Grant, the local attorney who had handled my grandmother's estate. He flipped through the documents and smiled slowly. "This is airtight. Sophie, this land isn't just protected. It's sacred, legally speaking. Cascade can't touch it. And if they try, we can take them apart in court." That night, Victor Hale returned, this time with 2 men in matching suits. They didn't smile as they walked up the porch. "Ms. Chandler, we need to talk," Hale said, his tone cooler than before. "You're about to enter a legal battle you can't win. Think about what this will cost you, financially, emotionally." Take our offer and walk away clean. I set the conservation documents on the porch rail between us. You're trespassing, I said evenly. And these papers mean your legal battle is over before it starts. Walk away, Hale. His jaw tightened, his carefully rehearsed mask cracking for just a second. You're making a mistake. No, I said, my voice steady. The mistake was thinking you could bully me. My grandmother fought you and so will I. This land isn't for sale. Ever. Behind me, the shutters slammed shut with a sharp crack, though there wasn't even a breeze. Hale flinched, one of his men stepping back instinctively. For the first time, they looked unsettled. Luke stepped onto the porch then, tall and unyielding, shotgun slung casually in one hand. You heard her. Get off this property. Hale didn't argue. He turned, stiff-backed, and climbed into the SUV. Gravel spit from the tires as they sped off. 2 weeks later, the case Cascade had filed was dismissed without a hearing, thanks to the Heritage Clause. Worse for them, an environmental watchdog picked up the story, and suddenly Cascade had bigger problems than me. Hale sent no more letters, no more offers. They were gone. Eric called out of nowhere, voice slick and too familiar. Sophie, I heard about the land's value. We could still work something out, maybe start over. I laughed, a sound sharp and real. You didn't want me when I was nothing. You don't get me now. I hung up, blocked his number, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel guilt, I felt free. The following weekend, Luke and I stood at the edge of the marsh, watching cranes lift from the water as the sun bled gold across the horizon. You did it, he said softly. No, I whispered, looking back at the house, its windows glowing warm like eyes. We did it. Me, Grandma, even the house. He chuckled, shaking his head. Guess some places really do choose their people. The shutters creaked gently, though there was no wind. And for the first time, I truly believed the house approved. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. The tension of the past, Eric's criticism, Daniel's mockery, Hale's threats, faded like background noise. In its place came the quiet rhythm of life on the land. I threw myself into the work, not out of obligation, but joy. I planted an herb garden where Grandma once had hers, its rows of lavender and rosemary perfuming the air. I restored the beehives with Luke's help, and by late summer, we had our first jars of golden honey. It tasted warm, floral, and almost electric, like it carried the soul of the marsh itself. The house seemed to respond too. The shutters no longer groaned at night. Instead, they swayed gently when I stepped onto the porch, like a greeting. Sometimes, when I worked late into the evening, the lights would flicker on in rooms I hadn't touched. At first, it startled me. Then one night, I just smiled and whispered, "Thanks, Grandma." The air warmed like the house was nodding. Luke became a steady presence. He never pushed, never asked for more than I could give, but his quiet company was its own kind of healing. Some nights we'd sit on the porch, drinking coffee, listening to crickets and distant frogs, speaking little but understanding much. One evening he said, "Your grandma used to say this place was magic, not the kind with wands and spells, but the kind that changes you if you let it." I looked at the marsh glowing under the moonlight. I think she was right. A month after Cascade's defeat, I drove into town for the farmer's market, my truck bed loaded with honey jars and bundles of herbs. People smiled when they saw me, waved like I'd always belonged here. Marjorie hugged me, saying, "Your grandma would be proud, and I think she'd be happy you're finally home." For the first time in years, I believed it. On a warm afternoon, I stood at the edge of the marsh where Grandma used to stand, the same place I'd dreamed of her warning me that first week. The cranes lifted into the sky, their wings flashing white against the blue, and I whispered, "I'm staying, Grandma. I'm not going anywhere." The wind moved through the reeds, soft and deliberate, like an answer. That night, I wrote in one of the journals from the attic. My entry was simple. Today, the house chose me back. When I closed the book, The shutters creaked gently, and I felt that same strange warmth wrap around me. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, breathing, belonging. This house had been mocked, devalued, even threatened, but it had endured. And now, so had I. When Luke joined me on the porch later that evening, handing me a steaming mug, he smiled in that quiet, sure way of his. So, what now? I looked at him, at the house, at the marsh glowing under the last light of day. Now, I start over. For real this time. The house gave a soft sigh, as if in agreement, and for the first time since inheriting it, I felt whole.